As Vladimir Putin continues insisting that Ukraine surrender the Donbas region, he's quietly trying to conceal a serious obstacle. Donetsk, one of the core areas inside the Donbas, is protected by a defensive wall that has already brought Russia's advance to a standstill. If Putin wants Donetsk, that wall must be shattered. But Russia's army hasn't been able to do it. Instead, its troops are grinding themselves down across roughly 30 miles of territory, paying for every meter gained with blood. At this point, Ukraine only needs to avoid one catastrophic strategic blunder, one that a supposed ally is now pressuring it to make. Together, those 30 miles form what is known as the Donetsk Fortress Belt. This fortress belt represents a massive defensive barrier blocking Putin's ambition to seize the Donbas. Positioned in western Donetsk, it is among the most heavily fortified zones in the entire country. For nearly a decade, Ukrainian forces have systematically transformed this region into a killing field designed to stop and destroy Russian troops. Multiple cities and towns are woven together to form this defensive line. 4 major urban centers, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and Kostiantynivka, combine to create an almost impenetrable shield that Russia has not yet been able to seriously challenge. Just outside the belt sit the battered cities of Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar. Once vital hubs of Ukraine's industrial heartland, they now serve as forward fortifications, linking with smaller surrounding settlements and the critical H-20 highway. Together, they present Putin with his most difficult military problem since the invasion began. It's a problem he would rather avoid entirely. And as we'll explain, there are 4 reasons why Ukraine would be making a grave mistake if it doesn't force Putin to confront this challenge head-on, so stay with us. Ukraine has deliberately prioritized fortifying these cities for a reason. Russia has taken them before. According to the Wall Street Journal, back in 2014, Russian-backed paramilitary forces seized all 4 of the major cities that now form the Fortress Belt. Ukrainian forces managed to retake them relatively quickly. But the message was clear. Russia had fired its warning shot, and Ukraine listened. Long before much of the world believed it, Ukraine understood that Putin would return to reclaim what he believes belongs to him. And so, Ukraine began its transformation. Those once occupied cities were rebuilt into what is now the Donetsk Fortress Belt. Today, that belt is stronger than ever, standing ready to defend Donetsk and possibly the rest of Ukraine from another Russian onslaught. The Wall Street Journal reports that Ukraine has spent more than $1 billion on fortifications in the Donetsk region alone. Given that large portions of eastern Donetsk remain under Russian control, it's reasonable to conclude that most of that investment has gone directly into strengthening the fortress belt. Over 10 years, Ukraine has turned this territory into a hardened stronghold. An interconnected system of trenches, deep anti-tank ditches, rows of concrete pyramids known as dragon's teeth, barbed wire, and expansive minefields. As The Economist noted in a January 7th report, Ukraine now possesses the 30-mile defensive line it desperately wished it had when Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. According to Vyacheslav Shutenko, commander of a drone battalion within Ukraine's 44th Mechanized Brigade, such defenses would have stopped Russian forces far deeper inside Donetsk had they existed earlier. The scale of these defenses is staggering. Near Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, defensive lines stretch nearly 200 meters, about 656 feet deep. These zones are packed with layers of razor wire and anti-infantry obstacles designed to shred advancing troops. Behind them lie massive anti-tank ditches more than 6 feet deep and nearly 10 feet wide, essentially open graves for Russian armored vehicles, which would become trapped and then annihilated by artillery and drone strikes. And the defenses don't stop there. More wire, more ditches. Minefields and dragon's teeth appear closer to the cities themselves. These fortifications run continuously across the entire 30-mile length of the fortress belt, making any breakthrough extraordinarily costly. And these are only the passive defenses. Ukraine's active firepower, especially its FPV drones, will constantly patrol the area, supported by reconnaissance drones and artillery units ready to strike any Russian soldier or vehicle ordered to cross into the belt. Inside the cities, the picture is just as grim for an attacker. The Economist reports that in Kostiantynivka, widely believed to be Putin's next objective if Pokrovsk falls, streets are already strung with razor wire. Ukraine is making its intentions unmistakable. Russia will bleed for every inch it tries to take. And even if Kostiantynivka were to fall, 3 major cities would still remain. Among them, the much larger Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. The fortress belt is even more sophisticated than it appears. According to the Atlantic Council, Ukraine has embedded non-traditional hidden defenses throughout the region to complement the static fortifications. These include concealed, flexible defensive nodes tucked into tree lines or buried underground. Supported by decoys and remote fire systems, these positions are designed to ambush Russian troops and funnel them into pre-planned kill zones where drones and artillery can devastate them. The war in Ukraine has often been described as a meat grinder for Russian forces. These hidden nodes act as the funnel, directing the meat straight into defenses engineered to tear it apart. Simply put, the fortress belt is a nightmare made real for Russia's soldiers. But if Putin wants Donetsk, this belt must fall. And Putin wants Donetsk badly. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the territory beyond the fortress belt is far less defensible. Once past the belt's hills and urban terrain, Russian forces would encounter flatter ground, allowing their advance to accelerate. Ukraine would then be forced to hurriedly construct new defenses across the Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk sectors. The Wall Street Journal agrees, noting that Putin likely believes the enormous human cost required to capture the fortress belt is ultimately worth paying. Still, it's a price he wants Ukraine to hand him for free, which brings us to the strategic mistake Ukraine must avoid. Today, the fortress belt is in the headlines not because of its military brilliance, but because it lies within the territory Putin is demanding Ukraine surrender. The reason is straightforward. The United States has reportedly renewed pressure on Ukraine to give up Donetsk and the wider Donbas region. On January 26th, United 24 media reported that the Kremlin reaffirmed territorial concessions as central to any peace deal, following talks between Ukrainian and Russian representatives in Abu Dhabi. Putin's chief spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, made Russia's position explicit, stating that the territorial issue is of fundamental importance to the Russian side. Ukraine has rejected these demands, though a second round of talks is scheduled to begin on January 31st. Then came another development. According to Reuters, the U.S. has told Ukraine it may provide security guarantees, but only if Ukraine agrees to hand over the Donbas. This would be a seismic shift. Such an arrangement would leave Ukraine more dependent on the U.S. and more exposed to Russia. Losing the Donbas means losing Donetsk, and losing Donetsk hands Russia control of the fortress belt. Worse still, there's deep uncertainty over what those U.S. guarantees would even look like. Just one day earlier, on January 25th, President Volodymyr Zelensky said a security guarantees document was 100% ready and awaiting signatures, suggesting no territorial concessions were included. 2 days later, Ukraine was allegedly being pushed toward the single worst strategic decision it could make. We say allegedly because on January 27th, the Kyiv Independent reported that the U.S. denied using security guarantees as leverage to force territorial concessions. The outlet cited an unnamed U.S. source who claimed Washington was not trying to force any territorial concessions upon Ukraine, adding that any peace deal must be agreed upon by both sides. That statement doesn't explicitly rule out pressure, but it offers Ukraine a sliver of hope. It has to. Because surrendering the fortress belt after years of preparation would be catastrophic. And there are 4 reasons why. The first is the most obvious. Losing the fortress belt would leave Ukraine dangerously exposed. That's true while the war continues, and it would remain true even if Ukraine gave it up as part of a so-called peace agreement with Russia. As the Wall Street Journal points out, capturing the fortress belt would place Russia in an ideal position to seize Donetsk and later push even deeper into Ukraine whenever it chooses. The belt would serve a dual purpose: a springboard for future Russian offensives and a shield against any Ukrainian attempt to reclaim lost territory. But why would that matter if Ukraine surrendered the belt as part of a peace deal? President Zelensky answered that question himself back in April 2025, when he revealed that Putin has violated no fewer than 25 peace agreements over the past decade. Ukraine understands exactly who it's dealing with. Putin is a leader who says one thing and does another. And Kyiv believes that any peace agreement that allows Russian forces to remain inside Ukraine isn't truly a deal at all. It's merely a temporary document, one Putin would discard the moment he believes Russia is ready to continue its conquest. This view is largely shared by Nick Reynolds, a research fellow specializing in land warfare at the Royal United Services Institute. Speaking to the BBC, Reynolds explained, even if the Trump administration attempts to use continued U.S. support or security guarantees as leverage given Russia's past behavior and the explicitly transactional approach taken by the U.S. administration, it's difficult to see why the Ukrainian government would willingly surrender that territory. And he's right. It would be extraordinarily difficult, especially when you consider the second major reason why giving up the fortress belt would be such a catastrophic mistake. Russia is actively destroying itself in its attempt to take the Donbas, and launching an assault on the fortress belt would only accelerate those losses. Ukraine today reports that Russia is unlikely to capture the Donetsk region before August 2027, an assessment that appears to be based on an ISW interview published in December 2025. That interview noted that while Russian forces have managed small infiltration attempts into Kostiantynivka, one of the key fortress belt cities, those operations have achieved little. The scale of resources required to overcome the entire belt is so immense that 2027 is the most optimistic scenario Putin can realistically hope for. Even 2028 remains a very real possibility, assuming Ukraine continues receiving sustained international support. That timeline would mean nearly 3 more years of fighting just for the fortress belt to fall, and Russia already knows it cannot afford the level of losses such a campaign would demand. Pokrovsk has proven that lesson. As mentioned earlier, Pokrovsk lies just outside the fortress belt. Before the war, the city was home to around 60,000 people. It has now endured more than a year under siege. According to the Wall Street Journal, Russia has concentrated over 150,000 troops in the Pokrovsk sector for what was supposed to be a decisive assault that would end last year, but the battle is still dragging on. Russia has already paid an enormous price for Pokrovsk. In October, journalist David Axe wrote in his Trench Art column that Russian forces had suffered 100,000 casualties between the start of 2025 and early October alone while trying to take the city. About a month later, Zelensky stated that Ukrainian drone strikes had eliminated 25,000 Russian soldiers, most of them operating in the Pokrovsk area. And those numbers have only continued to rise. The message is clear: Pokrovsk has been anything but an easy victory for Russia. Russian media once described Pokrovsk as the gateway to Donetsk, but that claim has collapsed now that the fortress belt stands fully prepared. And the cities Russia still needs to conquer, assuming it ever takes Pokrovsk, are even larger. Sloviansk had a pre-war population of roughly 111,000. Kramatorsk is larger still, with nearly 200,000 residents before the invasion, according to Le Monde. Larger cities mean more ground to seize, more resistance to overcome, and a far slower advance. Ukraine will also apply everything it has learned from defending Pokrovsk to these urban strongholds. So the question becomes unavoidable. If Russia has spent this long and lost this many soldiers trying to capture Pokrovsk, how much longer will it take, and how many more lives will it cost to break the fortress belt? Forcing Russia to confront that reality is one of the strongest reasons Ukraine must compel Putin into the fight he's trying so hard to avoid. It's even possible that Ukraine could replicate the 15-to-1 casualty ratio it has reportedly achieved in Pokrovsk, 15 Russian soldiers lost for every 1 Ukrainian. We break down what that ratio means for Russia's campaign in a separate video. At the heart of all this is Russia's attempt to frame Donetsk as a free gain, as United 24 media describes it. Putin wants the West, especially Washington, to believe that once Pokrovsk falls, the rest of Donetsk will collapse effortlessly. He pushes that narrative precisely because it's false. As long as Ukraine holds the fortress belt, it possesses a strategic weapon that could cost Russia years of additional fighting and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more casualties. What's most astonishing is that even the 2027 and 2028 timelines may be overly generous to Russia's faltering war effort. That brings us to the third reason why surrendering the fortress belt would be such a profound mistake. Russia's rate of advance is slowing sharply. According to the New Voice of Ukraine, ISW analysts have emphasized that the 2027 projection relies on conditions Russia is nowhere close to meeting. To capture Donetsk by August 2027, Russia would need to maintain the pace of territorial gains it achieved in November 2025, and even then success wouldn't be guaranteed. But Russia hasn't maintained that momentum. December 2025 and early January 2026 saw Russian advances slow to a crawl. If that trend continues, the fall of Donetsk could be delayed by months or even years. The implication is obvious and doesn't need much elaboration. The longer Russia fights for Donetsk, the more soldiers, tanks, artillery systems, and equipment it will lose. When we say Ukraine intends to bleed Russia dry across the fortress belt, we mean in time, hardware, and money, not just manpower. That leads us to the fourth and final reason why surrendering the fortress belt would be a disastrous strategic error. Ukraine still has no clear idea what it would actually receive in return. Russia has already made clear that certain actors will not be permitted to participate in Ukraine's post-war security. On January 26th, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service chief Sergei Narishkin declared that the security proposals offered by the so-called coalition of the willing were absolutely unacceptable. In practical terms, that likely means coalition forces would be barred from Ukraine under any peace deal. The following day, Russian State Duma Defense Committee Deputy Chairman Alexei Zhuravlyov reinforced that position by openly rejecting the idea of NATO troops deploying to Ukraine after the war. That effectively rules out the coalition of the willing and raises serious doubts about U.S. guarantees as well, given that the United States is a NATO member. In the end, Putin will not stop at Donetsk or even the Donbas if he gets them. He has openly stated that he does not believe Ukraine is a real country, repeatedly claiming that Ukrainians are simply Russians by another name. Handing over the fortress belt today would only set Ukraine up for collapse tomorrow. And with Russia already struggling to sustain the intensity of its assaults, such a concession would be a mistake Ukraine could never recover from. It won't make that mistake. Ukraine will hold its 30 miles of fortifications and Russia will continue to bleed trying to take them. That bleeding is already happening, and it's because Ukraine has an unexpected ally on its side. For centuries, this ally has often favored Russia, but now it's fighting for Ukraine and Moscow has no answers. This fortress belt represents a massive defensive barrier blocking Putin's ambition to seize the Donbas. Positioned in western Donetsk, it is among the most heavily fortified zones in the entire country. For nearly a decade, Ukrainian forces have systematically transformed this region into a killing field designed to stop and destroy Russian troops. Multiple cities and towns are woven together to form this defensive line. 4 major urban centers, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and Kostiantynivka, combine to create an almost impenetrable shield that Russia has not yet been able to seriously challenge.